Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Network for Landscape Conservation's Landscape Conservation and Action webinar series. My name is Kat Lyons, and I work as the Network Associate for the Network for Landscape Conservation. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're just waiting a few minutes to let people in, but I just wanted to share a brief welcome from the network, introduce our speakers today who we're really excited to have here today, and then go through a little bit of housekeeping rules as we move forward for this webinar. So, brief overview of the network. The network launched in 2011, and this network is a national umbrella group and leading voice for really advancing collaborative landscape conservation. We strive to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other, and we consider the network a community as much as an organization. We're a community really connected by the shared work of collaborative landscape conservation. So we strive to create opportunities for the community to learn together. And for this reason, we are extremely excited to continue this webinar series throughout the winter and into the spring. A brief bio of the speakers today. We'll hear from Kristin, Thomasgard, Todd, Holman, and Josh Pennington, and then a few logistics. As we listen to the presenters and panelists, please submit any questions that come up in your head in the chat or Q&A function on Zoom. And once the presenters are done, we'll have the remaining time, about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So with that, I'll welcome Kristin to share her screen and present. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks so much, Kat. And let me pull up my slides here. All right, can you see that okay? Is it coming through?
Yes, looks great.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, and a big welcome to everyone joining us. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Kristin Thomasgard. I am the Program Director for the Department of Defense Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program, more commonly known to folks as the REPI program. In that function, I also serve as the DoD representative to the Federal Coordinating Committee for the Sentinel Landscape Partnership. And so that's what I'm very excited to talk to you about more today, particularly given the exciting announcement we had earlier this week, designating some new landscapes, which I'll mention in a minute. I'm going to start out today by providing a little bit of background and explanation as to why landscape partnerships are so critical for protecting the Department of Defense mission and our critical operations. So historically, the Department of Defense military installations were located on lands that were not in high demand for competing uses. A lot of these lands were located far, far away from large populations. And this allowed the military to meet mission requirements for training soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, as well as testing equipment and weapon systems with minimal impact and with minimal conflict on our surrounding neighbors. Again, as populations and development increase, particularly around many of our installations, so too have the challenges that we've had to meet in terms of addressing those test, training, and operational missions. The following slides really help to provide an example of some of the tools that DoD and the military services, installations, and our partners have in order to sustain DoD's mission. And it really boils down to being more effective at working with multiple partners and working at a landscape scale where there are shared interests between conservation, working lands, and national defense. So as communities around military installations grow and development increases, most frequently our training and test activities have to change. Our installations are located across the 26.9 million acres of land that DoD owns and manages. And these lands contain high quality and often critically unique habitats. They provide food and shelter for more than 550 species at risk and nearly 500 federally listed threatened and endangered species. Of these species, 60 listed species and 75 species at risk are only found on DoD lands. And we recognize and take our responsibilities very seriously when it comes to managing for these species. However, as the communities surrounding these lands expand, these threatened, endangered, at-risk species lose important habitat outside of military bases and become increasingly more reliant on the remaining habitat, which happens to fall inside our fence lines. The requirements for on-base to manage is diminished as the habitat changes. And when the military is faced with having to balance habitat concerns with important training and testing requirements, it's often training and testing that have to alter and change the space that they're training in, the schedule, or the techniques, as that habitat has become more fragmented and diminished. So additionally, when we train, test, and operate, we make noise. Sometimes it's a little noise, sometimes it's a lot of noise. We also create dust, smoke, things that our neighbors don't always appreciate. This slide really helps to illustrate some of these challenges that DoD faces in accomplishing these missions. For example, development does reduce space for species, increases concerns about noise, and can add light pollution. Additionally, regulation, infrastructure, and energy needs increase management responsibilities, coordination, and planning. And climate change increases the risk of flooding, coastal erosion, wildfire, and drought, all things that impact our installations just as they impact many communities around the country. So now that you've heard about what we do and some of the challenges that we face, and some of the capabilities that we'd like to protect, I want to talk about the Sentinel Landscape Partnership and why this is so important to us. This is a coalition of federal agencies, state, local governments, as well as non-governmental organizations that are working to advance common land use objectives in high priority areas that we call Sentinel Landscapes. This was founded in 2013 by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Department of Defense, and Department of the Interior. And the partnership's overarching goals are to strengthen military readiness, bolster agricultural and forest productivity, and conserve natural resources, as well as increasing access to recreational space. The partnership has carried out this mission by connecting private landowners around military installations or ranges with government assistance programs that offset the cost of implementing sustainable management practices and conservation projects on their properties. The partnership has identified shared interests within a landscape and then coordinates mutually beneficial programs and strategies to preserve, enhance, and protect habitats and working lands near our military installations. The overarching purpose really is a mechanism to plan and execute mutually beneficial programs, projects, and activities. This can include preserving, enhancing, protecting habitat, working lands, and associated agricultural and forest production. We also focus on reducing, preventing, eliminating restrictions that inhibit military testing and training, and to also work collectively to forestall incompatible development near military installations. Our primary goal really to attract and prioritize both DoD and non-DoD investment around DoD locations where benefits can meet multiple federal missions, and to develop Sentinel Landscape branding that can help focus attention and resources on these important landscapes. And as of this week, there are currently 10 designated Sentinel Landscapes across the country. We did announce 3 new Sentinel Landscape designations on Tuesday, and those 3 new landscapes include the Camp Bullis Sentinel Landscape in Texas, Northwest Florida Sentinel Landscape, obviously in Florida, and the Southern Indiana Sentinel Landscape. This graphic just gives you an idea of some of the federal programs that are working together within the landscapes. Section 317 of the fiscal year 2018 National Defense Authorization Act formally recognized the Sentinel Landscape Partnership and institutionalized the key elements of the partnership that were initially outlined in an MOU between the three departments, which really provide for the designation of Sentinel landscapes, support for priority consideration for voluntary landowner participation in any easement, grant, or assistance program administered by the Secretary's Department, and also made permanent a quote-unquote funds as match authority for DoD, which was initially granted as an amendment to 10 USC 2684A, which is the statutory authority that often is referred to as the REPI authority, or the easement authority that DoD is relying upon. I want to close the presentation by simply re-emphasizing that there is no single solution that exists to mitigate or prevent encroachment. However, through partnership and through work with a diverse and robust group of partners, we can work in tandem on joint concerns regarding climate change, land use, economic development, endangered species, and many other issues of concern. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Todd Holman, who is going to help us take a more in-depth look into one of our Sentinel landscapes, Camp Ripley. And again, I want to thank all of you very much for your time and for the opportunity to speak with you today, and look forward to your questions in just a bit. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Kristin. I'm going to share my screen, and if you can tell me when you see it, Kat, that would be great.
Not yet.
All right, we're trying again.
No, Todd, go back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go next, just minimize that screen. No, and then down there, go share screen.
Oh, there it is. Sorry. I
Hit the blue share button.
got to get
Far
to
right.
this one.
It's highlighted. Now hit share.
There, now we're close.
Perfect.
Slideshow. And from the beginning. All right, sorry about that. Thank you, Josh, for saving my life again. All right, thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be presenting here today. This is an interesting and a great panel to have the director's voice. I'm a coordinator. I'm the Camp Ripley Sentinel Landscape Coordinator, one of the 10, and then you'll get to hear a voice from the installation with Josh next. I'll just clip through some of the slides that we've got that kind of give a deeper dive into so we're a focus group of one. Camp Ripley is a National Guard installation in central Minnesota. You can see the map on the right. We're kind of in the middle of 3 counties, but we're also at the interface of 2 ecoregional boundaries. So the blue on that Minnesota map is Northern Forest ecoregion, and the green is the Prairie Forest border. And that plays into understanding the landscape context. And so the first question for all of us in the business of landscape scale conservation work is, what is a Sentinel landscape? Kristin gave a great description of the program. Specifically, when you get to the actual site of where this happens around an installation or multiple installations, you have to define a boundary that makes sense for the landscape, partners that work within that boundary, and then can the work contribute to measured mission sustainability when executed? And then finally, it has a real application to private landowners, because at least in our Sentinel landscape context, most of the work is working with private landowners, farmers, forest landowners. And so you can kind of see where we are in the state and help to understand what that means. So when you look at this,
hey, Todd,
I'm
sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slides. Can you press from beginning again on your slides? Apologies for that.
Let's see.
Apologies for the tech issues.
Okay, no trouble. We're looking. You did see it to begin with, though?
We see it in presenter view.
Oh,
We
I'm
don't
sorry.
see it in presentation view. Let's see. And thanks all for commenting in the chat. We appreciate it. There's a present view at the, yeah, that guy. Try that.
Is it working?
We can't see it. We still can't see it. And I think it's which monitor you might be on if you have a couple screens on.
We're working from a laptop, so there isn't that, but.
Well, you're welcome to just shift through the slides on this view if that's easiest.
So go up here and show, and then come down here and try this. How's that? Is that any better?
It wanted to go for sure. Try from beginning again and we'll see. I think, yeah.
You're still not seeing it?
Thinking about it. Worst comes to worst, you can just shift the down arrow.
Yeah, if you're seeing it for some reason, it's on a dual screen and it's picking up both, but you can see it in this screen.
We can just see the presenter view where the slides are on the left side. We can't see the
We
screen.
may just have to roll through with this presenter view.
That's totally fine. Totally
All
fine.
My
if that makes
apology,
sense.
and this is one of my greatest fears. This is a new laptop to me as of yesterday, and this is the first time we're trying it. So that's on me, and I apologize for that. All right, we'll try to work with what we've got here. Land use and land cover. Again, it's those things that give the context for what you're doing and what land owners are doing on the landscape of scale, and then what partners, more importantly, what federal partners and state partners and local government partners have an interest or a stake. So as you can see in this map, the northern half of our Sentinel landscape is forested, the southern half is agriculture. And so it's easy to understand why the motto in our planning process was keep farms, farms, and forests, forests. That was kind of a motto that all of the partners used as we developed strategies and measures and metrics for how we were going to be define our success in the Sentinel landscape. And so again, you can kind of see this picture of interest. 50 miles of the Mississippi River runs through this, and we have our own threats kind of from the north side and the south side of urban growth and kind of encroachment around the installation. So as we looked at our landscape, half forest, half farm, these are the partners that we have in regular partnership now with our Sentinel landscape. And it started out, our program started out with the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program, a REPI program to kind of look at that first 3 mile buffer. But then in 2016, we were designated as a federal Sentinel landscape, and that opened up the whole conservation toolbox, the implementation toolbox, to do practices and work with landowners differently. And so these partners all came to the table, and you'll see it's a wonderful, diverse mix of federal, state, local government, and nonprofit organizations collaborating and working together. This is the implementation toolbox I was talking about. So when our program started as an Army Compatible Use Buffer program, we were on the right in the green doing just protection work, fee and easement acquisition. With the advent of Sentinel Landscape designation, then the whole toolbox became available to us and a whole suite of new federal, state, and local partners. And so this is a continuum all the way from left to right, which is left is just general information. Number 2 is technical assistance and so forth. And the landowner commitment goes up as you go to the right, and so do the costs. The beauty of this continuum is that landowners can enter the process anywhere along any of those columns. And what we found over the years running is that once landowners enter this implementation toolbox, they stay with us for the duration, and they may even graduate to higher levels of protection that meets the mission intent. So how do we do this? That's a lot of things to do on a landscape scale. And so we've broken that work into teams. And so certainly tight, strong, regular relationship with the installation is probably the most important thing. So we have that installation leadership team and the primary protection team lead, which is the Soil and Water Conservation District. And then I'm the coordinator. And so my job is to kind of convene and coordinate all of these moving pieces toward effective outcomes. Number 2 team is the protection team. Those are the historic ACUB team, the fee and easement folks. And that's where the Department of Defense leverage money comes from. And it's important. I didn't say this, but it's important that all those partners, federal, state, and local, are leveraging DoD contribution to this project to do more conservation with the Department of Defense funding and then leveraging state and other funding. The 3rd team is practices restoration and program enrollment team. And so this is just a quick picture of this. This is the greatest example of this team's work is applying for USDA NRCS Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP funding. And so that partnership delivers dollars for EQIP practices on the land, CSP, and Healthy Forest Reserve Program dollars for easement protection, as well as forest management dollars and practices. So that team oversees that type of on-the-ground implementation. And then finally, a very important team, the coordinating committee or the coordinating team is an interagency leadership team. So these are typically deputy directors of commissioners of state agencies. Sometimes the agency commissioner themselves would attend. But these folks give our whole program connectivity to the state agencies or the agencies from which they come to oversee our measures and metrics program direction, and then the overall strategic plan implementation plan. And the greatest example of late is that we're retooling our strategic plan to include climate resilience and build those aspects, measures and metrics into the plan as well. And so we're going to be working with all of these teams to deliver, but the coordinating team for oversight and guidance. And then finally, partners that benefit people we serve, the people we serve. And so this picture on the left are all the partners from all those diverse agencies that were here. And in Minnesota, this is no small thing. This is probably 3 years ago now, almost. 15 below zero, we had 150 people show up for a meeting voluntarily at night on Camp Ripley. And so this is the partner team that came to have booth exhibits, meet with landowners, and deliver their interest, because it's the partners that are benefiting from the Sentinel Landscape Partnership as well, in that they are able to deliver their mission and their priorities in the geography that we share and care about. And that picture on the right is just a picture of all the people. And if you look way in the back, you can see the posters and the tables that are set up. And that was the partners ringing the whole room, being available to those landowners. So thank you. Sorry for the glitch. And I'm going to hand it over to Josh.
Hello, my name is Josh Pennington. I work as the environmental program supervisor for the installation for Camp Ripley. And Camp Ripley is an Army National Guard training installation with range complex, essentially covering every type of weapon system or equipment that the Army has, from small arms to tanks to aerial gunnery. And on the screen here, I've put our mission statement of Camp Ripley, and I highlighted 2 things within that mission statement that is most relative to Sentinel Landscape. And one is train in a realistic environment. It's extremely important that we provide training opportunities both night and day, all times of the day, all times at night, to ensure that our men and women in uniform have the skills and confidence to essentially train as they fight, to use the equipment in a way that they would use it on our nation's worst day when we call them up for service. And that means as reducing as many restrictions as possible to that training. The second thing is fostering positive community relations. I would argue that the National Guard has a better understanding of this than any other Department of Defense branch, because being citizen soldiers, often we live in the communities surrounding the installation. But the Guard is also called upon to serve these communities, from everything from tornadoes to floods to even more recently civil disturbances. So it's important that we have the support of these communities so that we can effectively serve them. And one of the key elements to having that community support is recognizing areas where there could be conflict or where there's incompatibilities. And so on the image here shows the western boundary of Camp Ripley. And this slide had some really cool animations on it. So I apologize that it's not going to be visible in this display mode. But two of the things that affect Camp Ripley in terms of incompatibility is noise and wildlife, threatened and endangered species. So from a noise perspective, a lot of the training that we do, we understand that it makes a lot of noise. And the Army Public Health Command actually models that noise for every training activity that occurs on Ripley. So we have very accurate models, and we know very specifically where our noise reaches and what are the noise contours. And so we can say with accuracy where development, especially residential development, will be very incompatible, because it could either be nuisance noise or based on the decibel rating and the weather conditions. Under certain atmospheric conditions, the noise may travel farther off the installation, causing more of your window rattling incompatibility. So this image here is a plat map. And this occurred about 20 years ago, prior to the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program, prior to the Sentinel Landscape Program. And it was really a wake-up call to Camp Ripley to see that, underneath all of those and all those little squares on that screen are platted lots for future housing complex. And that is within our level 2 noise contour. So we make a lot of noise in this area. So it was a big wake-up call for us. But also, we have a lot of wildlife on the installation. As Todd mentioned, Camp Ripley is right on the border of 2 ecological provinces and has incredible biodiversity from some of the state's largest mammals. We have 2 packs of gray wolves that utilize the area. We have a very large population of black bear, and even golden eagles that surprisingly travel 1,500 miles to the north, typically around April, when Minnesota reaches 50 degrees and starts to get really balmy. These birds go up to nest in the cliffs on the Arctic Circle, and then they come back to Ripley each fall. So that represents a really large landscape where habitat fragmentation at that scale, it's a lot different than what local fragmentation has on our threatened and endangered species. And for the gray wolf, for example, their average pack territory is 100 square miles. And habitat fragmentation, to the extent that you see on the screen here, it pushes the wildlife onto the installation more, creating more difficulty from a management perspective, putting our ranges in check fire and things like that when they're limited to only being on the installation without having an ample habitat outside the installation. So after seeing that type of development that could occur, we really launched a very aggressive compatible use buffer program in 2004, working with 2 primary partners, the Department of Natural Resources and the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, later adding the Conservation Fund and the Nature Conservancy. And today, if you look at this ACUB current status, our partners have protected more than 35,000 acres in either private land conservation easements or fee simple acquisitions for wildlife management areas or state park and recreational trails. With the desired end state of having 75,000 acres within our noise contours of a protected landscape. And we're very well on our way to achieving that. We have 200 interested landowners that are ready to enroll. And we keep working with them every year. But now we're kind of, as Todd likes to use the term, we're moving the needle. So for so long, we were focused on acquisition and easements. And now we're recognizing that threats can also occur from these large protected lands if they're not managed properly. So improving agricultural operations, keeping farms, keeping them operational, managing and improving habitats from invasive species to fuel thinnings and forest management. You may not think of, Minnesota may not pop into mind right away when you think of climate change, but climate change is impacting Minnesota in a very devastating way. In fact, last summer was one of the worst droughts we have in recorded history. And we had over 100,000 acres in northern Minnesota that was impacted by wildfire. And one in particular burned for 30 days uncontained. And so wildfire is a significant threat to this landscape. And so building resiliency, and we've done a great job of working with NRCS to bring prescribed fire back onto the landscape and bring more forest management to the landscape to reduce the threat of wildfire on the installation and from outside the installation. And lastly, it's just empowering partnerships. Our success is driven by leveraging partnerships and leveraging funding to accomplish mutually beneficial goals, whether that's working with communities on building green space, working with state agencies on developing wildlife management areas or recreational trails. It's really a win-win. And, I personally, I don't think there's any more effective way to implement the mission of Camp Ripley than through the Sentinel Landscape Program. And that's been demonstrated here for certain. And a great example I like to show from an installation perspective. A few years ago, we had a gathering for a partner celebration for a large acquisition project for wildlife management area. And partners were talking about the benefits of this potential or this future old growth forest and everything from the herps to the turtles to all the wildlife habitat and all these great benefits. And the garrison commander looked over me at the time and said, "Josh, you know what I like best about trees? They never complain." And so despite our differences and why we pursue conservation initiatives, I think we can at least all agree on that. So it's been a great program for us, and that is all I have.
Great. Thank you so much all for the great comments and thoughts. Apologies for the technical issues. So I just wanted to highlight that we will be able to share the slides. So Todd, if you want to send them my way, I can disperse them to the current attendees. And Kristin, you can do the same. So I'll invite everyone to put on their videos, all the speakers, to kind of start the Q&A session. As I put in the chat, please submit your questions on the Q&A or in the chat as we move forward. But I just kind of wanted to pick up where you all left off. I think something that you have talked a lot about is kind of the Sentinel Landscapes. They work at this landscape scale, and they're working at the scale that nature works at when you're looking across these landscapes. So interested to know, how working on the ground, how you've seen that scale up. Have you seen more interest outside of those communities to get engaged, other NGOs, other organizations, and how have you fostered that engagement as you move forward with these programs and partnerships?
I guess I would start, again, this is Todd, and say that we started again with kind of a narrow focus, which was a protection fee and easement acquisition. And so we had built a couple of relationships with state agencies, DNR, about Board of Water, Soil, and then Nature Conservancy, NGO. But recognized quickly that we could be doing more. And I think that was the message from the REPI team, that we were potentially not leveraging the full horsepower of that DoD REPI contribution of finance and capacity to integrate more partners, more federal, state, and local partners. And so once we did that, we had, and those partners found that they could accomplish their acreage goals. They could connect significant forest corridors, in this larger landscape context. It became no longer just a narrow 3-mile buffer program. It really became a landscape program that everybody could put their shoulder into. And then they could bring their own funding too. They had their own programs that would add to the success. And so Kristin's team demands annual reporting. We all have to be accountable for the work we do. And so it's great to be able to not just report what the buffer success is, but to report what all the partners are doing in that Sentinel landscape. And for us, last year's numbers were like $3.5 million worth of compatible activity going on in the Sentinel landscape, in addition, to the work that we were doing historically on fee and easement. So that's a great success story to tell. It shows kind of how you guys have a term, force multiplier or something like that, how you can kind of start, with a small core team, but then build in all these. And then the last thing I'll say, and you can tell I enjoy this work a lot, these folks like to work together. This is one of the programs, the Sentinel Landscape Program is one of the places where the state agencies can say, we can be successful here because this partnership is staying, they're working well. And it's always an open door to new opportunities. New NGOs bring new things, and even new programs and new funding sources. We're looking now at that Infrastructure Act, that was just passed. And so everything that comes new from the federal government, everything that comes new through our state, we're all thinking together how we can apply that in the Sentinel Landscape program. So that's a great outcome.
Thanks so much. Kind of on that note, I'll just read this question that came in. I'm kind of focused on scaling and how the Sentinel Landscapes have scaled as they've expanded partnerships. So I'll just read this one from Catherine Romans. One of the biggest limitations here is capacity. We'd love to scale our ambition and impact, but all of our land trust and nonprofit partners are working on the outer limits of their staff capacity. I think we all feel that and hear that. So in addition to the coordinator position, how does Sentinel Landscape program help scale up capacity of the broader community? What are kind of the functional ways in which you achieve that capacity building?
Todd, do you want to talk about that at the local level? I can share some thoughts at kind of a broader level, but it might be more applicable to hear sort of how that factors in at your landscape level.
Sure, I've got a great example, and thank you. I wasn't sure what level you wanted to answer that question, but we've got one good example about capacity increase. And to your point, Kat, you're spot on. The questioner was spot on, right? Everybody's kind of at the top of their ability to cover the bases, and we recognize that in our partnership too. One of the things that kind of was a great outcome for us working with the USDA NRCS at the state level, and through our federal success with Regional Conservation Partnership Program, was that we identified capacity needs too. And with that ability to talk directly to our state conservationists came aside from the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which is the money to do technical assistance, to do work, to do practices, came a state funding package called a direct agreement. And so it was a direct agreement with Camp Ripley and with the Soil and Water Conservation District, one of our lead partners, to pay for a staff person to work on the installation, to work on Camp Ripley. So it's actually a Soil and Water Conservation District staffer paid for by NRCS to deliver NRCS programs, and then using the RCPP program to pay for the practices. So it was a great example of how to increase capacity by partnership, because we found ways to articulate our shared goals.
And just to add one clarification on that, that capacity that was hired, and they don't work on Camp Ripley. All the work they do is with private landowners surrounding Camp Ripley. But one of the challenges from a capacity perspective was housing the position. Who's going to supervise the position? Where is the office going to be? And the Soil and Water Conservation District was just completely maxed out in office capacity. They didn't have any room to grow. And so that's where Camp Ripley's leadership said, well, we've got plenty of space on the installation. We'll offer up an office space, and Josh can help coordinate make sure the guys come and work on time. That's pretty much what I do. So the installation did step in to develop an MOU with the Soil and Water Conservation District to help staff that capacity.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that on a broader scale, and this is part of the relationship that helped to provide some resources to support the position that Todd and Josh are talking about. A couple years ago, the REPI office entered into a partnership with the National Association of Conservation Districts. So we actually have a cooperative agreement with NACD, and that agreement has facilitated an opportunity for us to provide resources at the national level that can be paired up with resources from NRCS as well. They also do obviously quite a bit of work, particularly technical and capacity building work at the conservation district level. And we identified pretty quickly, as everyone's saying, I couldn't agree more, capacity is probably the biggest challenge. We are not short of ideas. In many instances, as we look at some of the new resilience dollars coming out, we're not short on dollars. We're short on having the staff on the ground to coordinate those dollars, because shockingly, the federal government doesn't make it easy to get access to, use, and then have to report on what you did with the money that was provided. And so that's a lot of work. And I've heard from multiple states and local governments that they have projects, they have ideas, but they don't have the capacity to actually be able to use the money that the federal government is offering, because it's so much work to actually apply for it, receive it, and then report on what you're doing with it. And so really getting capacity on the ground in as many ways as possible is one of our objectives. And so NACD was one of those relationships where there are resources available through that national level agreement to pair up with other dollars to help support local capacity. We're also looking at potential relationships through organizations like the National Association of Counties. We already work with the National Conference of State Legislators. Again, not necessarily on the capacity front with NCSL, but identifying ways that states might help to identify capacity, where we could then partner with a state to provide some resources to assist. I mentioned in my opening remarks this idea that the REPI funds, DoD funds, can be a non-federal match. A lot of federal climate resilience conservation programs do require some type of local match or non-federal match. DoD REPI funds can be that non-federal match, but you have to have access to those DoD REPI funds first in order for them to be applied. And so one of the things that we're really looking at, and Sentinel Landscapes provides a great opportunity to approach this, and that is, how do we get those dollars on the ground in the hands of local government, whether that's city, county, state agencies, NGOs, that can then bring those dollars to the table to help draw in additional dollars, because we are in a unique position with REPI funds being able to be used in that way. And one of the challenges, and this is something that we're working on, access to REPI happens through a partnership with an installation. So an NGO partner, a local government, a state agency really has to engage first with that installation, develop that relationship, establish an agreement at that local level so that we have an avenue to provide REPI funds to support those efforts. And so there are a lot of steps in that process, and that's the nature of how the program's set up. That doesn't mean that we're not looking at ways to streamline that. And I think what's been so amazing about the Sentinel Landscape Partnership is that these landscapes really present test beds for us to try to pilot a different way of doing business. And if we had 10 Todds and Joshes, we could have really an incredible number of additional partnerships, because we have to give them a lot of credit. They're doing some amazing things. Camp Ripley is a phenomenal example of what Sentinel Landscapes can be, and Todd and Josh have to take a lot of credit for that. They have been critical to bringing those folks to the table, and people make the biggest difference in these partnerships. I think anyone who's involved in this work knows that you can have the best ideas and the most money on earth, and if you don't have the right people engaging in that work, you're not going to achieve the outcomes. And so we've got some really good people, particularly at Camp Ripley, and that's made an incredible difference. And we need to thank them for all of that hard work. It's an incredible partnership there.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all for those great comments. I think we definitely have a lot of questions about the scale, because I think folks are really excited about seeing the on-the-ground proof and metrics and viability of a program that could expand farther. But I think, Kristin, you just brought up a barrier, that, the engagement on that local scale to really work with the installation, really fostering that relationship is really key. But one question that came in, and keeping that kind of barrier in your heads, from John Seaback, to the question about scaling up, what are 2 or 3 things that you could really enable, that could really enable DoD to build, expand, and improve the Sentinel Landscape program nationwide? And you can talk a little bit more also about the newer installations, what that process looked like, and how I know, folks are interested in engaging in this process more.
Sure, I'll I'll comment quickly, and then Bruce may have ideas. I know Bruce has ideas. I won't say I think Bruce has ideas. I know Bruce has ideas, and Todd and Josh probably have some great perspective as well. One area that I think has been a priority for DoD from the beginning of this partnership is looking at ways that we can streamline and better leverage multiple federal program authorities. So how can we take multiple federal programs that are aligned with different federal agencies that have different congressional roles in terms of rules and procedures, and almost create I'll oversimplify it, but a pot of Sentinel Landscape funding, or an ability for us to pool those federal resources in a streamlined fashion so that we can provide dollars on the ground that accomplish multiple federal program objectives through a less administratively burdensome process. Anyone who works on the ground understands that you've got to apply for each of these programs. Each of these programs has a different timeline. We have a different set of rules. We have a different process of evaluation. And so, one way and one thing that I'm interested in, and obviously having external, outside of the federal government, partners advocating for these things as well, is to create sort of a Sentinel Landscape application for federal resources, so that we as the federal agencies pick a group of programs that we think are effective at achieving outcomes within Sentinel Landscapes, pick 3 or 4 as a pilot, come together, create a single application process for access to those resources, and a single reporting mechanism for the recipient of those funds to be able to report back to the government. Obviously, we have accountability requirements. We have to have management controls on how federal program dollars are spent. But can we streamline that process for Sentinel Landscapes as a start point? Again, I said that's a great test bed for let's pilot an approach where we streamline this. I think this is becoming increasingly more critical as we see huge dollars allocated for climate and resilience objectives. These are huge pots of money, but if states, localities, partners don't have the capacity to access them, and we make them so complicated that we can't get them implemented, they're not going to help achieve the outcomes that they're intended to achieve. And so what are some ways that we can make that easier for the folks who we depend on to implement the projects and achieve those outcomes? Because we're not doing that at the federal level. No one in DC is implementing a project on the ground and achieving the outcome. We can change the policy and the approach to how those dollars get allocated. So I think that's a huge area that I think needs focus both inside the government, but also outside the government. And I'll pause there and let Todd, Bruce, others weigh in.
Yeah, I don't think we have anything. That was such a great explanation. We don't have anything to add to that.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I think we're seeing also comments come in, about other programs that people on the ground are using, like LWCF. How do we streamline these? How do we look at these programs across the board at this larger scale to better streamline? And I think you'll see something that will also come up a lot in many different avenues for Network for Landscape Conservation is the RCPPs. So I think a lot of folks are really interested in how Todd and the teams on the ground have used RCPPs, how they've leveraged that to success, because that has been somewhat of a challenge for these landscape collaboratives to achieve, and what extent and what are some of the partners that contribute to those projects when you're going for those RCPP funding.
Yeah, we've had, we're actually in our phase 2, we have a renewal of our RCPP application. The first one came when we first became a Sentinel Landscape, and just to say it again, it's true that once designated as a Sentinel Landscape program, that is a weighting that is considered, for federal program approvals and things related to that. So that was our first success. And it really required a whole team. It required local soil and water conservation districts. It required our NRCS partners we have 3 counties that touch our Sentinel Landscape. So coordinating between the 3 counties, and then identifying kind of what is NRCS seeing? Each had their own list of needs and, things that they couldn't provide service for or have funding for. And so trying to assess, what everybody's needs were, including the mission needs. The mission needs were every bit a part of that conversation too. So where can we focus programs to attack high nitrate wells, for example? What practices can we do on the land that would go after that particular issue? Where can we protect forestry corridors that are involved in training? So C-130 training here at Camp Ripley and those noise issues that Josh answered or brought up earlier. So we looked at all of those pieces, to decide that partnership. Then who's all involved in the RCPP is part of the delivery and the capacity piece I touched on before, that now NRCS, separate from RCPP, has helped us fund through Kristin's appropriation through the NACD, additional person capacity to actually deliver not only the practices, but the outreach and the training that goes with it. Because one of the other things we saw lacking was we didn't have enough training for people to write forest management plans or fire plans. And so part of the work of this person that's now funded, and I appreciated Josh's clarification, because the person offices at Camp Ripley, but all of their work is with private lands outside of the installation. But this wouldn't happen without that collaborative partnership and the spirit of NRCS seeing the value, need, and shared benefit goals. So we hope to keep building on that RCPP and direct agreement over the longer term so that we can continue to keep delivering what now landowners have expected. I can talk more about that, but Josh, do you want to add to that at all? Good. Okay.
Kat, I was going to add a little bit to that. In addition to what Kristin was saying, the desire to scale up, it is about building the Sentinel Landscapes brand and particularly trying to advance that at the state level. So there's been a lot of emphasis and talk about federal involvement, but the state is equally important. And if you look at the states where Sentinel Landscapes are currently located, usually defense and agriculture are either the top two or top three or top four economic drivers for those states. And so having a active military presence and having a strong agriculture sector within a state is extremely important for the economic development and the continuing economic development of those states. And so, providing a program where there's the overlap of interests of national defense, agriculture, working lands, and conservation, I think it provides states just an extremely beneficial opportunity to engage. And so it's kind of a push-pull dynamic. We're interested in working with states more directly so that the states become interested in targeting their programs to benefit Sentinel Landscapes, that in turn will pull in and draw additional federal funding. So that's another area we're interested in exploring and advancing in scaling up Sentinel Landscapes into the future.
That's great. Thanks so much, Bruce, for the addition. Yeah, and I think kind of looking at that scale of partnership. So we're hearing, at that local scale that really focusing on the installation and relationship, then having those type partnerships at that state scale, and then the federal approach of how do we change policy to streamline things. I think that's coming really clearly through, and something that we all, as landscape conservation folks, kind of have a good sense of these different mechanisms at different scales. So really appreciate the context there. We have a couple more questions, and I know we're running low on time, so I want to try to get to these, but I'll focus a little bit more on the second question that Catherine put in the Q&A, and I'll read this verbatim. We've had board and funders ask, what does Sentinel Landscapes really mean in terms of new dollars for conservation and stewardship? Do you all have a sense of average number of dollars per year that the Sentinel Landscape designation opens up across the existing Sentinel landscapes, i.e., we went for X number of dollars this year in conservation funding towards funding conservation on the ground?
So there are two ways that I'll offer some response to this question. One, in terms of what does Sentinel Landscapes really mean in terms of new dollars, there is a direct benefit of dollars for capacity. Sentinel Landscapes, the partnership itself is not a funding program. So there's no such thing as Sentinel Landscape program dollars. The dollars that make up Sentinel Landscapes come from the federal agency programs that contribute to the partnership. However, we have a relatively small pot, we hope to grow over time, of funding, which is funding from DoD, funding from NRCS, funding from private partners, endowment, to support capacity. And those are the coordinators that we fund directly on the ground. We're looking at expanding that capacity with some new money that we're hoping to get with an FY22 budget. You know, everyone's hoping to get an FY22 budget for climate resilience. So being able to look at putting some climate resilience coordinator capacity into Sentinel Landscapes as well. So those are kind of direct dollars for capacity. In terms of kind of opening up and seeing a difference in the total amount of funding that comes into a landscape, the new accomplishments report for Sentinel Landscapes that was just released does lay out the dollars from the federal agencies and others that are coming into these landscapes. So I would certainly encourage folks to take a look at that new accomplishments report, which is available on the sentinellandscape.org website, and to look at that in comparison to previous year's reports. So that'll give you a sense of kind of the overarching scale and scope. And then I'll give one specific example, and I'm probably going to get these numbers wrong, but I'd be happy to share them with Kat, and she can pass them on to the group. Fort Huachuca, as an example, the Fort Huachuca Sentinel Landscape actually did an assessment of this. And I believe that they were somewhere in the range of DoD contributing kind of 3 or 4 to 1 relative to partner contributions when they were an ACUB program. And you heard Todd mention that. That was the Army Compatible Use Buffer. They're an Army installation. So that was really an easement-focused program. When they became a Sentinel Landscape within, say, about 2 years, their stats now show it's 7 to 1. So for every dollar that DoD is putting into that landscape, they're drawing $7 of non-DoD money. That's coming from multiple federal sources, local sources, state sources, private sources. And they've been very successful with RCPP, so that's been a portion of that funding. But in that case, there was a very specific transition from DoD contributing the bulk of the funding, which was honestly not a large amount of money overall, but getting little return from others, to being able to kind of identify a set of shared priorities, which then drew a much larger pot of money that has had really significant impacts across that entire landscape, to include drought resilience work, to include wildfire mitigation work, and a large number of other factors. So I do think we see that, but it's a great question and something for us to think about as from a federal agency perspective, to be able to articulate more clearly the overall impact that Sentinel Landscapes has had. So I appreciate that question, and that's certainly something that I want to do a better job of being able to articulate.
I'll just add from an installation perspective, and not necessarily directly related to dollars and cents, but from a program perspective, as Kristin mentioned, prior to Sentinel Landscape, we were focused on ACUBs and acquisitions and noise diversion or buffering. And with the Sentinel Landscape program, we dramatically shifted to partnering for more practices and more restoration opportunities and managing the landscape. And we've had farmers come up to us in public engagement meetings and said, you've saved my family farm. I was considering developing, but this agricultural easement is what kept me in the game, kept me farming. And so hearing those stories is really what has made a dramatic difference from when we were just a compatible use buffer program to a Sentinel Landscape program. Now we're even looking at, as I mentioned earlier, looking at resiliency and forest management for wildfire threat diversions and reducing risks from wildfire, all related to Sentinel Landscapes.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Todd.
No, I wanted to do one last shout out to credit you and the FCC is where I wanted to go.
Well, thanks, Todd. I'll just say quickly, Judge, when you said that, you reminded me of something that I think may not be obvious to everyone. I think DoD has learned a lot through the Sentinel Landscape Partnership, in that there are an incredible number of landscape level practices and sustainability approaches that have a tremendous benefit on DoD's ability to operate. That was not necessarily a lens that we initially looked through at the very beginning, back in the early 2000s when the REPI program was coming into fruition. We were looking at how do we maintain compatible land uses through minimizing development that was not beneficial or not compatible with what our missions were. We have, through kind of the creation of Sentinel Landscapes and a lot of vision that Bruce has brought to this process, I think we have changed the way that a lot of people in DoD and a lot of folks at our installations look at the use of land around our installations and beneath our airspace, and recognize that we don't need to permanently protect everything. That is a critical tool, and we're going to keep using it. But the more farmers we keep farming, foresters we keep foresting, ranchers we keep ranching, the better off we all are. That's food security, water security, biosecurity, and national security. And those things come together. That's a pretty impactful message. And you find very few people in Congress that can't get behind some part of that. They may not be behind all parts of it, but they're going to get behind some part of it. And that, I think, is the really, really impactful benefit that I think we've been able to achieve with Sentinel Landscapes. And I think there's a lot more that can be done. So thank you to everyone, who's participating today and all the work that you're doing, because that's ultimately how this happens. It's not us, it's you guys on the ground, like Todd and Josh and everyone who's listening in. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So we are over, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time and the speaker's time. So I'll just wrap up quickly. We didn't get to all the questions, but the speakers will have access to them if they can address them moving forward. But thank you so much, Kristin, Todd, and Josh, for letting us learn from you today, and Bruce for jumping on. This is an incredible conversation, and I look forward to more conversations. And I expect folks will be reaching out to you to learn more about RCPP and all the great work that you're doing. But this webinar is part of the ongoing Landscape Conservation and Action webinar series. A recording of this webinar also will be posted on the network's website in a couple days. So you'll access this webinar, and then I'll work to send out the slides to everyone as we move forward. You are welcome to please visit our website. I've just put the link in the chat. That's where you can see new webinars coming up. We have exciting topics coming up on March 31st, on 24th at 1 p.m. We're actually gonna have a speaker, Dr. Jessica Hernandez, focused on her new book, Fresh Banana Leaves, Healing Indigenous Landscapes Through Indigenous Science. So we're really excited to have that. And as always, thank you all so much for your attendance. We are extremely grateful for your participation in this webinar series. Your participation makes this continue moving forward, and we're excited to have you continue to engage with the Network for Landscape Conservation. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and apologies for going over a little bit, but thank you all again to the speakers and for all of your participation. Thanks, everyone. Bye.